That thing, that was no dog. That was too big to be a dog. That thing was bigger than me.
911, what are you reporting?
I got a strange going on out here. Something just killed my dog.
Something killed your dog?
Two of them across the creek at the big rocks.
Now improvised search parties are attempting to find it. Just what it is, no one is sure.
Creatures actually exist.
In between the 1800s and early 1900s, the town of Resezu in northern Minnesota was stalked by something otherworldly. The early white settlers were in a state of panic. It was said that to see the monster in the woods was a sign that death would follow. What was this being? It had many names, but for my purposes, we will use the most common: the Wendigo. The Wendigo was an evil nomadic spirit whose hunting grounds ranged about the Great Lakes region of America and Canada. Translated, its name means the evil spirit that devours mankind. Around 1860, a German explorer translated Wendigo to mean cannibal in the Algonquian dialects. There were several tribes within the Algonquian people: the Ojibwe, Eastern Cree, Soltioks, West Main Swampy Cree, Naskapi, Lenape, Sekani, Innu tribes, and more. So it comes as no surprise that the descriptions of the Wendigo were varied. But what it represented was always the same. The Wendigo was the raw hunger, famine, and greed that came with long winters. Long winters like the one of 1878. A Plains Cree fur trapper named Swift Runner ate his family. His oldest son died of starvation. Now the exact facts are not known, but at some point Swift Runner butchered and ate the boy. But he didn't stop there. Swift Runner would go on to devour his wife, brother, and 6 remaining children. According to Edmonton Sun reporter Andrew Hannon, he wandered alone into the Catholic mission in St. Albert in the spring of 1879, claiming to be the only member of his family who didn't starve to death over a particularly cold, bitter winter. The priests were suspicious at the claims, since Swift Runner seemed a healthy 200 pounds. They reported him to the police, who took Swift Runner back to his camp in the woods, northeast of Edmonton. What they saw was the stuff of nightmares. The site was littered with bones and bits of flesh. Some accounts even say that large bones were broken in half and marrow was sucked out. Swift Runner confessed that he, in his own words, shot some of his family, bludgeoned others with an axe, and even strangled one girl with a cord. In some accounts, Swift Runner said he fed one of the boys human flesh before he too was killed. But he also claimed innocence, until the day he was executed at Fort Saskatchewan by hanging in 1879. He said that he had been possessed by the Wendigo. Was Swift Runner actually possessed? Or was he just a lunatic? One can wonder. Because sometimes, the things that go bump in the night do exist. I bet you're picturing the Wendigo right now. You're thinking a thin but powerful monster with the head or skull of a stag, complete with antlers or horns. You'd be wrong. This version of the Wendigo has no footing in Algonquian folklore. It seems to be more of a modern adaptation that has borrowed aspects from the Navajo skinwalker. The Wendigo is typically described as a thin, but abnormally tall corpse. Its skin is stretched tightly against the skeleton, creating a thin, translucent layer of desiccated flesh. Its color varies from bone white to ash gray. It has long, spindly fingers that end in sharp claws. Its teeth are often yellowed, jagged fangs, and are always exposed, as the first thing a Wendigo is said to eat is its own lips. It's alleged to smell like death. There is an interesting description that comes from Inuit lore that states that Wendigos are giant ice monsters that tower over man. And this is because every time a Wendigo eats a man, it grows in proportion to the meal. The bigger the meal, the bigger the monster will grow, and so will its appetite. There lies a woeful truth: the Wendigo's insatiable hunger. The more they consume, the more they grow, the more they need to eat to silence its demanding hunger. But the hunger can never be silenced. because behind a Wendigo is another Wendigo, causing the curse. Confused? There's two types of Wendigos. The original non-human Wendigos can be found in the Pawnee creation myth, as the giant men that came before the Pawnee and were destroyed by the god Tirwa Atias for being proud and blasphemous. They were not easily killed. Tirwa struck them with lightning, but they were unharmed, so instead Tirwa flooded the land and drowned them. Even then, some managed to survive and scurried into the wilderness, and watched as the Creator God made the new race of man. With time, they became an unseen spiritual force similar to that of a Christian demon. They inhabit and attack the dreams of their victims, forcing them to stay awake, making them sick and feverish until their victims tear all their clothes off and run off into the woods screaming madly. This is often referred to as Wendigo fever. The human Wendigo, type 2, was once a man who, after torment and influence at the hands of a spiritual Wendigo, committed cannibalism. Though not as dangerous as the spirit kind, these Wendigos are the ones we think of when we hear the name. They were said to be excellent hunters, with enhanced abilities. They were extremely fast, had unnatural strength, heightened senses, and endurance. They were able to control the woodland creatures and weather. The oldest amongst them were even able to summon a darkness that could block out the sun. The saving grace of the mythos is that these monsters were lone hunters, often called the spirit of the lonely places. In the original folklore, one could attempt to cure a person possessed by the Wendigo spirit by the consumption of copious amounts of hot grease from animal fats. But often this didn't work, and the only course left was murder. A human Wendigo could be killed two ways. If the Wendigo was an ice giant, you could headshot the human body hidden in the ice, and then hack away at the ice body to get to the human in order to dismember it. If the Wendigo was the more traditional corpse-like being, then simply removing the heart, which had turned to ice at this point, and melting it would do the trick. You know, for a creature said to be a legend, there are plenty of documented cases. Though the following cases are attributed to Wendigo psychosis, a mental disorder where one craves human flesh, there are still examples of human Wendigos. The earliest known case of Wendigo-related murder and cannibalism occurred inland in 1741 and was recorded in the Fort Churchill Journal. But the name Wendigo was not mentioned. In 1772, at Fort Severn, a deranged individual who had previously succumbed to famine cannibalism was executed by his family after confinement proved ineffective. The family's fears persisted after the execution because their superstition led them to believe that the cannibal could hunt after death and prey upon human flesh. In 1767, north of Lake Superior, Alexander Henry observed an Ojibwa man who had killed and eaten 4 relatives during a food crisis, and apparently, after tasting human flesh, nothing else could do. Henry notes, he ate with relish nothing that was given to him, but indifferent to the food prepared, fixed his eyes continually on the children which were in the Indian lodge, and frequently exclaimed, "How fat they are." The natives were obviously alarmed, and Henry documented how the man was put to death, for the safety of the children, of course. In 1799, a self-proclaimed Wendigo was executed near Lake of the Woods. The unknown native man expressed a desire to eat his sister. The father was deemed responsible by the tribe for not soliciting the help of a medicine man while there was still time. In 1897, 2 women from Whitefish Lake were taken to a missionary for treatment after one of them had a dream of her deceased brother offering her human flesh to eat in a bowl of ice. Both women mysteriously fell ill afterwards and were thought to be Wendigos by their people. If they had stayed in their homes, they surely would have been put down, but thankfully, they recovered and never consumed human flesh. In 1899, at Cat Lake, Joseph Jacquiemu was arrested and put under trial for killing Francois or Felix Auger. There's conflicting sources on the name, but his nickname was Mapanin, and he claimed to have been taken by the devil. This account was documented in several sources, but it's the journal of Francis Buren that offered the most insight. Mapanin said the devil was taunting him, urging him to kill his children and to eat them. He would tell the people who tried to care for him that his heart was freezing and that soon he would be a cannibal. The afflicted man asked to be killed before he could kill others. He rejected regular food and grew thin and frail in appearance. Joseph obliged the request to be euthanized by taking an axe to Mapanin. It's a long and interesting story, and I could have made this entire episode on just Mapanin alone, and I encourage you to read more about it. The townspeople failed to remove Mapanin's alleged ice heart and melt it, so they anticipated that he could rise again. To make up for this mistake, they toppled large trees over his grave to prevent or stall his return. The stack of felled trees allegedly can be visited today near Trout Lake, and it's called the Wendigo Grave. In October 1907, Jack Fiddler and his brother were arrested for killing over 14 people who they claimed were Wendigos, or about to become Wendigos. Jack Fiddler was famed amongst his people as a Wendigo hunter and claimed to have successfully slayed 14 of the monsters. Some, he claimed, were sent to harm his people by enemy shamans, and others were members of his own tribe who were taken with an insatiable, incurable desire to eat human flesh. In the latter case, Fiddler was asked by family members to kill a very sick loved one before they turned Wendigo. In some cases, the Wendigo, him or herself, would ask to be put down rather than become a monster. Fiddler's own brother, Peter Flett, was killed after turning Wendigo when the food ran out on a trading expedition. In early 1907, 2 officers from the Northwest Mounted Police visited Island Lake and heard tales of Fiddler's power against Wendigos from Norman Reyes. The cops, eager to establish Canadian law among the natives, went to the sucker camp at Deer Lake and arrested Jack and Joseph Fiddler for murder. For most of the sucker people, the Mounties were the first whites they had ever seen. The elderly brothers were charged with murdering, and I'm sorry if I pronounced this wrong, Wasakapikwai, Joseph's daughter-in-law, the year before. They were held at Norway House to await trial. The Canadian media ran with sensational headlines of murder and devil worship. Across the country, people demanded justice, while the police conducting the trial saw an opportunity for fame and advancement. On September 30th, Jack Fiddler casually escaped captivity during a walk outside. Unfortunately, all the upheaval had been too much for him. He was found with a noose around his neck of his own will just a day later, a fate his brother would share. Joseph Fiddler went to trial. Angus Ray, the eyewitness, testified that Wasakipakwai was killed while in deep pain and incurable sickness, according to the custom of their people who were not aware of Canadian law. Pressed on the Wendigo issue, Ray admitted that it was a belief among his people, and that Jack and Joseph were the ones who were usually asked to euthanize the very sick and prevent Wendigos. Despite some other unreliable testimony from Ray, and the pleas of missionaries and HBC traders, Joseph met the noose. Sometime in late 1920, in Fort Kent, within the city archives, one can find an interesting story of a young unnamed doctor. The doctor and his wife had just moved to the town. He started an in-home practice to help the people of Fort Kent. His practice was successful until a swarm of rats came into the town carrying a plague of smallpox and spread the infection. The doctor treated the sick the best he could, but he knew they would die. And unfortunately, his young wife was also caught in the infection, and when she died, he became a recluse. He isolated himself in his home. He denied patients and built shrines to the dead body of his wife. As the story goes, in this isolated and weakened state, he was preyed upon by the Wendigo spirit. No one in town knew that the doctor's wife had died, and when he started seeing patients again, people were relieved. The doctor slowly invited one person after another into his home, killed them, and ate them. Once the townspeople started to notice more and more people were going missing, they began suspecting him. So the doctor went on a rampage on the town of Fort Kent. He killed and ate all but 11 people in 1921. He ate their flesh and left a pile of bones. In 1921, it was recorded that 150 people had lived there, and no one had seen the doctor. It's told that he ran off into the woods, leaving everything in his home behind, and that he was possessed by the Wendigo. The townsfolk of Fort Kent say that you can still hear him screeching with laughter at night in the woods. The frequency of Wendigo psychosis decreased sharply in the 20th century as Native Americans came into greater contact with the Western ideologies. Documented cases of Wendigo psychosis are now harder to find, but there are still some very interesting stories. Charles Chuck Latimer had his encounter published in the 14 Times magazine about 20 years ago. Chuck was a hunter from Delta County, Michigan. He was born in 1939 and was a seasoned hunter, well accustomed to the woods and forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He also knew of the strange tales of the forests of Northern America, but Chuck was a logical man and didn't believe in the superstitious lot. Though he had heard strange sounds that as a seasoned hunter he didn't recognize, he had never seen anything odd. Those who knew him said he was an honest, salt-of-the-earth type of man with a no-nonsense attitude. Several years after his death, his son Andrew submitted this story to the 14 Times. Chuck's story takes us to Gwinn State Forest, Michigan, December 1983. Chuck was 3 days into a solo hunting trip. It was in the early afternoon and he had been having a rough day. He was tracking a large buck over treacherous terrain that was completely covered in snow. He trekked into a clearing and laid eyes on his prey. The buck was quite a distance away and he was downwind from it. He knew he had the time, so he carefully aimed his Remington rifle and took the shot. A wave of disappointment hit Chuck after he pulled the trigger. The buck reacted to the shot, but instead of toppling over, it ran into the woods. His aim had been off by 3 inches, he estimated, and that prevented the shot from being fatal. Still, he reasoned that it was mortally wounded and would succumb to the fatal shot. All Chuck had to do at this point was follow the trail of blood. He was halfway into the clearing when things started feeling odd. The air grew thick and dull, and all the noise seemed to be erased from the woods. He felt vulnerable, exposed. He continued forward, but with caution. As he approached the tree line, he saw the downed buck. It was breathing heavily. Its hot, labored breaths were visible in the cold environment. He readied his hunting knife and continued on, but stopped just 30 feet away. Just behind the deer was a mass of white. At first he thought it must be a mound of snow, but now he could see that it was moving, as if attached to the wounded buck. He felt a wave of fear as a face appeared from behind the buck, an inhuman face. It had blood around its mouth and had a vile expression. The creature moved into a defensive posture between Chuck and the deer and screeched harrowingly at him. That was all it took for Chuck. He started running back to where he came from. He made it back to his camp and abandoned his trip early. According to his son, Chuck never went hunting in those woods again. When speaking of the creature, his father would say it was incredibly thin, and despite being crouched low to the ground, Chuck could tell it was very, very tall. Its skin was almost as white as the snow. He would tell the story often, even while he was dying from cancer, and even while lying in his own deathbed. He told his story one last time. David Paulides, an ex-police officer turned author, believes that there's something in the forests and woods of northern America. He has cataloged thousands of mystifying deaths and disappearances. Paulides started researching the disappearances after a visit to a national park when a park ranger approached them and told him about a search and rescue effort on a couple of recently unexplainable disappearances. Paulides was an accomplished outdoorsman and didn't think it would be likely that many experienced hikers could simply vanish. A man of reason, Paulides began to investigate, but eliminated cases from his workload that involved foul play, mental illness for the possibility of suicide, animal attacks, probable drownings, etc. What he had left was intriguing. All the inexplicable disappearances centered around North American national parks and the Great Lake regions. His conclusion is that there's an apex predator, a master of stealth, an excellent hunter, cunning and intelligent, hunting those areas. Here's a small recap of some of his strangest cases. Keep in mind, all conventional theories have already been disproven. In Ellerslie, Georgia, 2002, 20-year-old Christopher Tompkins was working as a part of a four-man surveyor crew near the dense woodland in Harris County. At the end of the day, they headed back to their vehicle and were walking along Warm Spring Road, a straight highway which is bordered by woodlands on both sides. Each man was only about 50 feet apart, and Christopher was the last one in line. Within a blink, he vanished. The rest of the crew went back to look for him, but only found spare change on the ground. They also discovered one of his work boots snagged on the barbed wire fence lining the road, as well as fibers from his work pants. A search was fruitless. Several months later, his other boot was located near a swamp, 900 yards from where he was taken. The fact that they found the contents of his pants pockets on the ground suggests that he had been flipped upside down. In September 2004, 49-year-old Bart Slayer was preparing for a moose hunt. He was strong, fit, clever, and had been hiking and hunting since he could hold a gun. He chartered a pilot to fly him to a remote region 175 miles north of Whitehorse. The pilot dropped him off and per agreement was set to return 3 weeks later. When the pilot did return, he found Bart's camp set up and well stocked, but could see no sign of him. After an extensive search, they eventually found a few of his teeth and shards of bone on the ground about 60 feet away from his camp. Not too far away from these remains, they found his dry bag on the ground, indented as he had been sitting on it, and his hunting bow perched against a tree. Examination of bear and wolf feces in the area ruled out the possibility of him being attacked by a large animal, and his camp's pristine condition further ruled out a wild animal attack. Stephanie Stewart worked as a wildlife spotter for Jasper National Park in Alberta, Canada. On the night of the 26th of August 2006, she was stationed in the remote Athabasca Lookout Tower, situated 25 miles northwest of Hinton. On the morning of August 27th, she failed to carry out a routine radio check-in with her supervisor. Another fire spotter arrived at the station to check in on her but found the tower empty. The only thing missing was Stewart's blanket, and there were no signs of a struggle. Her truck was still parked outside, and investigators found no tracks leading to or from the area other than her own truck. She was never found, and her disappearance made the provincial government change the way the lookout towers operate. In July 2010, a man named Eric Lewis was climbing Mount Rainier with 2 other people. They were tethered together only 15 feet or so apart. The lead climber, Don Storm Jr., stopped at 14,000 feet and waited for his 2 companions. He wanted to reach the top as a group. Nice guy. He was joined by the second climber soon after, Trevor Lane, and then they both waited for Eric to reach them. After just a few minutes, they reeled in the rope and discovered that Eric was not tethered to them anymore despite being there just minutes before. They assumed that he had decided to take a break, and they headed back down the mountain hoping to find him, but were very disappointed. They only found his tracks, which suddenly stopped. Search and rescue recovered his backpack, climbing harness, and snow shovel at 13,600 feet, but Eric remained lost. The Northern American national parks are beautiful and wondrous, but under that, there is a mystery that authorities don't seem to want to address. It's been called the nation's silent mass disaster. People have been disappearing from national parks by the thousands over the last few centuries. The exact numbers are not known because, surprisingly, the National Park Service has only recently begun to catalog the disappearances. Paulides seems reluctant to label a culprit or cause behind the strange disappearances, but his books seem to strongly suggest that it's something abnormal and predatory. Perhaps that something abnormal is the legend that the Algonquians feared so much, a legend that developed for a reason. The North American forests are expansive, and it's safe to say that there are still areas where no man has laid foot before. It's not hard to believe that there may be a creature out there, expert in stealth, silent and cunning, an apex predator that hunts men, a Wendigo. Well, for once, I hope it does not exist. And there you have it. That is episode 2. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to it. There's actually a lot more that I could have included in this episode, but I didn't want to make this ridiculously long. There was, for example, a French man named Tarare. I strongly encourage you to look up his Wikipedia. That had pretty much all the symptoms of being a Wendigo. I mean, he was a cannibal, though that was not inherently proven, but he did try to drink people's blood while at a hospital, and a baby disappeared while he was there. Anyway, there's a lot more to this that I couldn't add, and it was a fun thing to research. I strongly encourage everyone to find out more about Felix Auger and read up on Paulides if you find his book. The book is titled The Missing 411, and it's such a great read. I mean, this guy has been thorough, and definitely pick it up, check it out. All right, well, thank you guys, and see you in another 2 weeks, hopefully, and appreciate you listening. Ciao.